The lower Elwha Clallam tribe is gathering to celebrate their first day of fishing on a free-flowing Elwha in over 100 years.
Nature has a way of surprising us, and the Elwha River is the ultimate proof. After 2 massive dams were blown up, 8,000 salmon were tossed into the water to see if they could survive. Most experts expected a total failure because these fish had no memory of the river. But these were not normal salmon. They were the start of an ecological revolution that transformed a starving forest into a thriving paradise.
It's a rainy morning in October, and over 10 years have passed since dams were removed from Washington's Elwha River.
The return rates were through the roof, and the impact on the land was unlike anything seen in modern history. This is the miracle of the salmon. The impossible return of the king. 8,000 salmon were dropped into a river that had been considered biologically dead for nearly 100 years. This happened in the Elwha River, located in the beautiful state of Washington. For decades, this water was nothing more than a quiet, empty ghost of its former self. 2 massive dams, one built in 1910 and the other in 1927, had completely choked off the flow of life. These concrete walls were over 100 feet tall and did not have any way for fish to get past them. Before the dams, the Elwha was a legend among the local people and the wildlife. Over 400,000 salmon would fight their way upstream every single year to lay their eggs. These fish were massive, with some Chinook salmon weighing more than 100 pounds. That is heavier than a medium-sized dog or even some grown people. But once the dams went up, the music stopped. The upper 70 miles of the river became a graveyard where nothing could spawn and no nutrients could flow. By the late 1990s, fewer than 3,000 fish were returning to the very bottom of the river, and they were stuck there. They could not get to their ancestral homes, and the river was starving. But here is the deal. In 2011, the government decided to do something that had never been done on this scale before. They did not just try to help the fish, they decided to blow the dams up. It was the largest dam removal project in the history of the world. Huge machines tore into the concrete, and for the first time in a century, the Elwha River ran free from the mountains to the sea. But there was a massive problem that kept scientists up at night. The river had been silent for 90 years. That is at least 3 generations of salmon that had never seen the upper parts of the water. In the world of biology, many thought that the genetic memory of the fish was gone. It is like asking a person to find a specific house in a foreign country without a map or a phone, just because their great-grandfather once lived there. It seemed like a total gamble. To fix this, researchers from the United States and Canada teamed up. They brought in salmon from other nearby systems and released 8,000 young fish into the upper river. They hoped for the best, but they prepared for the worst. Most people in the field thought that maybe 1% of those fish would ever find their way back. If you release 10,000 fish and only 100 return, that is usually seen as a success in the brutal world of nature. But the Elwha salmon were about to prove that they do not follow the rules found in textbooks. Everyone was obsessed with what would happen when the first group of fish reached adulthood. In 2014, the first survivors of that original 8,000 started to show up at the mouth of the river. They had spent 1 year in the freshwater and 2 years out in the vast Pacific Ocean. Now they were following an invisible signal back to a place they had never actually seen. And they did not just show up in small numbers. They came back by the thousands. By the time 2015 rolled around, over 3,000 adult salmon had returned to the upper reaches of the Elwha River. If you do the math, that is a return rate of over 37%. To put that in perspective, a 5% return rate is considered a massive win for most hatchery programs. These fish were coming back at levels that had not been seen since the 19th century. It was an absolute miracle that left the scientific community scrambling for answers. The fish were not just surviving, they were thriving in a landscape that had been empty for a human lifetime. The crazy part is that these fish were not just swimming in the water, they were acting like a biological cleanup crew for the entire valley. When a salmon returns to its home river to spawn, it eventually dies. That is just how the cycle works for Pacific salmon. But their passing is not a waste. Each fish is like a tiny nutrient bomb from the ocean. They are packed with nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon that they gathered while swimming thousands of miles in the deep sea. When they die in the river, they fertilize everything around them. This is often called a salmon subsidy, and it is one of the most efficient ways nature moves energy from the water to the land. For 90 years, the forests surrounding the Elwha had been starving for these nutrients. Without the salmon, the trees were smaller, the soil was poorer, and the wildlife was thinning out. But suddenly, there were thousands of decaying fish lining the banks. It sounds gross to us, but to the forest it was a five-star feast that had been missing for a century. Some researchers even began to whisper about a wild theory. What if the trees themselves were calling the fish back? There is evidence that trees communicate through underground fungal networks. Some believe the starving forest sent out chemical distress signals through the soil and into the river water, effectively baiting the salmon to return to the area where they were most needed. It sounds like science fiction, but the speed of the recovery makes you wonder if there is a deeper intelligence at play in the soil. But that was only the beginning of the surprises waiting for the researchers. The river was not always a ghost town, though. A century of concrete silence. To understand why this comeback was so shocking, you have to realize just how bad things had become during the years of the dams. Before the concrete walls went up, the Elwha River was the heartbeat of the Olympic Peninsula. It was one of the only rivers in the region that supported all 5 species of Pacific salmon. The Chinook, Coho, Sockeye, Pink, and Chum salmon all called this place home. The local indigenous people, the lower Elwha Klallalum tribe, had lived alongside these fish for thousands of years. They called the giant Chinook salmon chief because they were so powerful and respected. These fish were the foundation of their culture, their food, and their spirituality. When the dams were built to provide power for a local paper mill, no one asked the tribe for their opinion. They just watched as the heart was ripped out of their land. The fish hit those concrete walls and simply had nowhere to go. They would beat themselves against the base of the dams until they died, unable to reach the gravel beds where they needed to lay their eggs. It is not that simple, though, because the loss of the fish affected much more than just the tribe or the fishermen. The entire ecosystem started to fall apart like a house of cards. Scientists have discovered that trees growing near salmon streams can get up to 25% of their nitrogen from the fish themselves. You can actually trace the chemicals from the ocean inside the wood of a tree that is hundreds of feet tall. When the dams blocked the salmon, the forest began to starve in slow motion. The trees did not grow as fast or as strong. The insects that feed on the fish remains disappeared, which meant the birds had nothing to eat. Small mammals like minks and otters moved away because the river was empty. Even the bears, which are famous for catching salmon, had to find other ways to survive or leave the area entirely. The Elwha became a quiet, lonely place where the water still moved, but the life was gone. For nearly 100 years, the dams sat there, collecting silt and blocking the path. The reservoirs behind the dams, Lake Aldwell and Lake Mills, filled up with millions of cubic yards of sediment. This sand and gravel were supposed to flow down to the coast to build beaches and provide habitat for small fish and clams. Instead, it was trapped behind the walls. This caused the river below the dams to become armored. This means the water washed away all the small rocks and left only big, heavy boulders. Salmon cannot lay their eggs in big boulders. They need nice, clean gravel. So even the small area of the river that was still open to the sea became a terrible place for fish to live. It was a double blow. The fish could not go up and the habitat below was ruined. Most people thought that even if you removed the dams, it would take centuries for the river to heal itself. They thought the damage was too deep and the silence had lasted too long.
And that is putting it lightly, because the engineering involved in removing the dams was a nightmare of its own. You cannot just blow up a dam and walk away. If you did that, all the trapped silt and mud would rush downstream at once and suffocate every living thing in the water. It would be a wall of toxic sludge. The engineers had to carefully lower the water levels and remove the dams piece by piece, allowing the river to slowly carry the sediment back to the sea. It was a delicate dance between destruction and restoration. While the dams were coming down, the water turned a chocolate brown color because of all the mud. Critics said the project was a waste of money and that the river would be a muddy mess forever. They claimed that the salmon would never find their way back through that murky water. They believed that the history of the river had been erased by the concrete. Some radical thinkers suggest that the dams actually preserved a sort of primordial energy.
By stopping the flow, they created a pressurized environment where the river was forced to concentrate its natural power. When the dams were finally removed, it was not just water that was released, but a century of bottled-up biological intent. This might explain why the recovery happened in years rather than decades. The river was literally exploding back into existence with a force that defies traditional ecological models. But nature has a memory that is much longer than human records. What most people do not realize is that the fish have a secret. The secret GPS. Inside every fish. Yeah, about that Canadian connection mentioned earlier. While the American scientists were working on the dams, their neighbors to the north were studying something incredible. For a long time, the world of science believed that salmon only used their sense of smell to find their way home. The theory was that as a baby fish swims toward the ocean, it memorizes the unique chemical scent of its home stream. Years later, it follows that scent back like a breadcrumb trail. This is called imprinting. While this is true, the Canadian researchers found out it is not the only way salmon navigate. It turns out that salmon are basically living, breathing, high-tech navigation units. They have multiple backup systems that they use to cross thousands of miles of open ocean and find the exact spot where they were born. The crazy part is that salmon have tiny crystals of magnetite in their brains. This allows them to actually feel the magnetic field of the Earth. They use this like a built-in compass to know which way is north and south while they are in the deep sea. They also use the position of the sun and a complex internal clock to keep track of where they are. But wait, there is more. They can even detect the polarized light in the water, which helps them see clearly even on cloudy days. All of this means that when the 8,000 salmon were released into the Elwha, they were not just swimming randomly. They were setting their internal GPS to a new home. Even though their ancestors had been gone for a century, these fish were able to create a new map in their minds. This discovery changed everything for the restoration project. It meant that scientists did not have to find fish that were direct descendants of the original Elwha salmon. They could bring in cousins from other nearby rivers, and the fish would be smart enough to adapt. This is why the return rate was so high. The 8,000 fish were not lost. They were simply pioneers. They used their magnetic sensors to find the coast of Washington and then used their sense of smell to find the fresh water of the Elwha. Once they entered the river, they kept swimming until they found the perfect gravel beds in the newly opened territory. It was a masterclass in biological navigation that proved nature is much more flexible than we think. But here is the catch. Just getting the fish back to the river was only half the battle. The river was still a mess from a century of being trapped. It was straight, fast, and lacked any of the hiding spots that baby salmon need to survive. In a healthy river, you have fallen trees, deep pools, and side channels where the water moves slowly. The Elwha had none of that. It was basically a giant waterslide made of rocks. The scientists were worried that even if the adults laid their eggs, the babies would be washed away by the first big rainstorm. They thought they might have to spend millions more dollars to build artificial habitats and move logs into the river with helicopters. They were prepared to do the work themselves because they did not think the fish could handle it. The thing is, the salmon had their own plans for the construction work. Consider the possibility of ancestral memory on a cellular level. Some fringe theories suggest that DNA can store geographic data. Even if these specific fish had never seen the Elwha, their distant relatives had. This theory proposes that the frequency of the river's vibration matched a dormant code in their genes, effectively unlocking a map that had been hidden for generations. It is as if the fish were tuned into a specific radio station that only this river broadcasts. Building a River One nest at a time. So here's the deal. When the salmon returned, they did not just lay eggs and die. They started a massive construction project that reshaped the entire valley. Scientists call this geomorphic engineering. It sounds like a complicated word, but it basically means the fish were acting like tiny bulldozers. When a female salmon is ready to spawn, she digs a nest in the gravel called a redd. She does this by turning on her side and flapping her tail with incredible power. This kicks up the rocks and washes away the fine sand and mud. She then lays her eggs and moves slightly upstream to do it again. As she digs the second hole, the gravel she kicks up covers the first one, protecting the eggs from predators. Now imagine thousands of salmon doing this at the exact same time. On the Elwha, the returning fish were moving thousands of tons of sediment every single year. All that digging and flapping started to change the shape of the riverbed. They were breaking up the hard, compacted ground that had been sitting there since the 1920s. By moving the gravel around, they created a complex pattern of humps and holes in the water. This created riffles, which are shallow areas where the water gets plenty of oxygen, and pools, where the water is deep and cool. These are exactly the kinds of places that fish and insects need to survive. The salmon were literally building their own nurseries, but it gets even better. The impact of the salmon went far beyond the water. Because they were returning in such huge numbers, they attracted every predator in the area. Bears, eagles, and otters started dragging the fish carcasses out of the water and into the woods. They would eat the best parts and leave the rest to rot on the forest floor. This spread the ocean nutrients far and wide. Within just 3 years of the first big return, researchers started to see a change in the plants. Using special tests, they found that the nitrogen from the sea was appearing in the leaves of bushes and the needles of evergreen trees. The forest was waking up from a 100-year nap. The trees started to grow faster, which meant they would eventually fall into the river and create even more habitat. It was a perfect feedback loop of life. The crazy part is how fast the rest of the animals responded. Birds that had not been seen in the upper Elwha for a century suddenly reappeared. Dippers, which are cool little birds that actually swim underwater to eat fish eggs and insects, started nesting along the banks again. Bald eagles lined the trees during the fall, waiting for the salmon feast. Even the insects exploded in numbers. This provided food for the young salmon that were hatching in the gravel. The entire ecosystem was rebuilding itself from the bottom up, and the salmon were the ones leading the charge. It was a level of success that no one had dared to dream of when the project started. There is even a theory that the salmon are terraforming the planet. Some researchers suggest that salmon migrations are a deliberate mechanism developed by the Earth to transport minerals from the deep ocean back to high-altitude mountains. In this view, the fish are not just biological entities, but part of a global pump system. When we blocked the pump with dams, the planet's circulatory system stalled. By removing the dams, we didn't just save fish, we restarted a geological engine that keeps the land from eroding into nothing. The rapid evolution of a miracle. Basically, everyone was looking for a return to the past, but the salmon were busy creating the future. When researchers started taking tissue samples from the new Elwha salmon, they found something that blew their minds. These fish were not exactly like the ones that had been released. In just a few generations, they were starting to change. This is evolution happening in real time. We usually think of evolution taking millions of years, like a dinosaur turning into a bird. But in the Elwha, it was happening fast enough that scientists could see it during their own careers. The fish that returned were larger than expected, and they were changing their run timing. This means some were entering the river earlier in the spring, while others waited until the fall. By spreading out their return times, they were ensuring that the entire river stayed fed for a longer period. They were also developing different physical traits that helped them survive in the specific conditions of the Elwha. Some were better at swimming through the fast mountain water, while others were better at hiding in the deep pools. The river was choosing which fish were the strongest, and the salmon were responding by adapting at lightning speed. It proved that nature is not a static thing, it is a living, breathing process that can pivot when the environment changes. Of course, it was not all perfect. With so many decaying fish in the water, the river experienced some growing pains. In some areas, there were so many nutrients that algae started to grow too fast, which can take oxygen away from the water. There were also human conflicts. Some fishermen were upset that so many fish were being protected for restoration instead of being caught. Some people worried that the new fish would mess up the genetics of other wild populations. And then there is the big issue of climate change. The world is getting warmer, and the water in the Elwha is a few degrees hotter than it was a century ago. This puts a lot of stress on the salmon, but so far they have shown that they are incredibly tough. Could it be that these salmon are actually more intelligent than we realize? A controversial idea floating around is that salmon possess a collective consciousness. When one fish learns a new path or a new survival trick, the entire population benefits through a shared mental field. This would explain why 8,000 fish were able to act with such precision in a foreign environment. They weren't just 8,000 individuals, they were a single, focused mind working to reclaim its territory. As we look at the Elwha today, it is impossible to see it as anything less than a place of profound hope. For nearly a century, this river was silenced, choked by two massive walls of concrete that stood as monuments to a different era. Across the Pacific Northwest alone, there are over 1,000 dams, and many of them have become old, inefficient, and arguably useless. For decades, the narrative was one of defeat. Skeptics argued that we could not remove these structures because the fish were gone, the habitat was destroyed, and nature would never truly recover. The Elwha has proven that this narrative is fundamentally flawed. If you give nature even the slightest opening, it will fight with everything it has to recover. The restoration of the Elwha taught us that the path back to health is not a quiet or sterile process. It is messy, it is loud, and it is often chaotic. When the dams came down, millions of tons of sediment, the literal lifeblood of the river, surged downstream, clouding the water and reshaping the coastline. But within that chaos was the blueprint for resurrection. Today, the river is pulsing with life, the riparian forests are reclaiming the gravel bars, and the chiefs, the legendary Chinook salmon, have finally come home to their ancestral kingdom. It all started with a population of barely 8,000 fish and a small, dedicated group of people who were willing to believe in a miracle when the rest of the world saw only a lost cause. What many people fail to realize is that we are not merely spectators to this transformation. We are an intrinsic part of the cycle. The recovery of the Elwha has rippled outward far beyond the riverbanks. It has breathed new life into the local economy, drawing researchers, photographers, and tourists from across the globe to witness this ecological rebirth. For the lower Elwha Klallam tribe, the return of the river is the return of an identity. It has restored their traditional foods, their sacred sites, and a cultural continuity that was nearly severed by the dams. We are learning, through the Elwha's success, that the environment is not a separate entity we simply inhabit. It is a living system to which we are inextricably connected. When the river is healthy, the community thrives. When the salmon return, they bring with them a sense of ecological and social balance that has been missing for over 100 years. They carry nutrients from the deep ocean back into the heart of the mountains, feeding the eagles, the bears, and the very soil that supports the towering cedars. It is a powerful reminder that even when an ecosystem looks dead, there is always a spark of life waiting for the right moment to explode. Some observers even suggest that the salmon's return is more than a biological success. It is a spiritual sign. Ancient legends of the Coast Salish people often spoke of the salmon as a powerful people who lived in a grand village under the sea. According to these stories, the salmon would only put on their fish skins to visit the human world as a gift of sustenance. When the dams were built, that bridge was broken. The people under the sea were locked out of their own home. By removing the dams, we did more than just clear a path for migrating fish. We mended a broken contract between humanity and the earth. While science looks for markers of success in nitrogen levels, gravel distribution, and DNA samples, perhaps the real story is written in the spirit of the landscape. The Elwha serves as a global blueprint, proving that our past mistakes do not have to be our future. It shows us that if we have the courage to step back and let the river run, the earth will forgive us, the life will return, and the ancient cycles will begin anew. The Elwha River is living proof that we can fix the mistakes of the past if we are brave enough to try. But is this success enough to save all the other dying rivers in the world? Or are we just lucky this time? Let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe for more incredible stories from the natural world.